What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Roi Ben-Yehuda, and we speak about the role of courage in facilitation and presenting. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. Now, lean back to enjoy the show. Roi, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you.
Looking forward to speak about courage and facilitation.
I'm looking forward to speak about courage and facilitation as well, to share some knowledge, to learn from you. I've been excited for this moment.
Yay! Likewise. And before we start, the question with which I always kick it off, and sometimes we go places and maybe we end up not talking about courage. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
When I facilitate, sometimes I think that I call myself a facilitator. I'm not sure. I think first time it was actually a label that was put on me. I was labeled as a facilitator. I joined a company that did leadership training and they called us facilitators. And so up until then, when I worked as an educator, I was an adjunct professor at the university. I saw myself as a teacher first and foremost. And I would describe myself when people ask, like, what do you do for a living? I'm like, I'm a teacher. I like that. Some of my favorite people in the world have been teachers. And so I called myself a teacher, identified as a teacher, among other things. But then when I was stamped as a facilitator, I had to think about like what that means. And I like to look up the origin of words. And I remember that when at first I started calling myself a facilitator, I looked that up and I saw that the origin of the word means to make easier. The Latin origin of the word facilis is to make easier. And I thought, you can't really be a good teacher without being a good facilitator, without making that transfer of knowledge easier for folks, without simplifying the complexity, without helping them develop in whatever way you want to do. And then it became like a badge of honor to call yourself a facilitator. And so I started doing so. My main role today has shifted a little bit. And so I facilitate a lot, but I don't know if it's as primary, as salient an aspect of my identity as it used to be.
Before I ask you how you self-identify today, let me first ask the question, how did the realization of facilitation is and can do impact your teaching? Well,
it's a great question. I started thinking about, well, what are some of the ways that I can simplify the complexity? And what are some of the ways that I can make this easier on the participant? Whatever this is, whatever the goal is of the training. And the moment I started asking those questions is the moment where I became conscious of what I was doing well and what I could do better. And so just thinking about the idea of what a facilitator is helped me become a better facilitator and a better teacher.
Also maybe because the attention shifts from the self to the group, to the other, to the recipient of the knowledge?
Yeah, there's less, I think that's another really great point. Less concern, less focus in, more focus out. And less concern for self, more concern for others, which makes you also less self-conscious, makes you less anxious as a teacher and as a facilitator. And you really are focused on the people there.
Yeah.
Gives you more courage too.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the literature on courage shows us that one of the most dominant strategies that people utilize to engender, to summon courage, is to link up their actions to something beyond themselves. And so if I'm going into the classroom focusing out as opposed to navel gazing and focusing in, then I'm less anxious and I'm willing to, in whatever fears and anxieties that I may contain, I'm overcoming them for the sake of the group or for the sake of the purpose of the session itself.
Good point. And I think as a facilitator, you also trust that the group has some knowledge and you can pull it out. You can include them in whatever you're going to create for them. So it takes a lot of pressure off your shoulders.
It does, right? And you start to think, it goes back to those earlier questions, like how can I make this easier for folks? How can I simplify that complexity? How can I bring them into the conversation? You move from like a power over perspective as the teacher, as the almighty teacher, to a power with. And like we're collaborating, we're doing this together.
And I wonder, before we hit the record button, we spoke about questions. Yeah. And when I think of the traditional teacher, a teacher would ask questions where there is a right answer to. Whereas the more interesting questions that might facilitate the learning in the longer term are the questions that make the students think. And asking a question where there's not a right answer, but make the student think, requires more courage because you cannot control the answers that come up. So you're basically putting yourself in a situation where you have to react with whatever comes up instead of just saying, sorry, it's wrong. Next one.
Right. Yeah. So on that note, Miriam, do you have a favorite type of question that you like to ask to make that happen?
Yes, I think there are a few questions, and then it depends on the topic and the context, right? I think they're nice questions. They're easy to answer. They're kind of nice icebreakers. Everyone can just blubber something. But then they're kind questions that after you ask them, you have this silence where everyone is like, ooh, let me think about that. And I think these are the real interesting ones where you can get the group to, and these are usually the ones that challenge the status quo. I was recently asked the question, what do you tolerate? Or yesterday I was with a group of colleagues and the question came up, what do you stand for? Mm-hmm. And if you ask this to a team, maybe you don't need much more of an agenda for the remaining program.
Yeah. And so you're thinking about like categories of questions and questions that you said nice. And the other category was kind. Mm-hmm. What you said. And your kind was to challenge the status quo. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. What are your thoughts about defaulting into a mode of like, not just inquiry, but people often talk about open-ended questions. I broaden the space for response, closed-ended questions. Any thoughts on that?
Don't get me into questions. I can speak about questions tomorrow. What I find interesting are the why questions. And I would be curious about your relationship with why questions. Because for me, a why question can be sharp like a knife, almost like a weapon, because a why question doesn't invite to wander or to dream or to go on to tangents. A why question focus on the core, on the beliefs, on identities. So you need sufficient amount of trust to ask the why questions. On the other hand, the what if questions, they keep you safe. These are the nice questions. Everyone can think of a what if. And the reason why I said kind for challenging is that a kind question empowers you and gives you autonomy or agency to create your own solution and to seek for an answer within yourself instead of just going for the easy route.
Yeah. My thoughts on why questions, I have, I guess, a love-hate relationship with why questions. I put them in the category of reasoning questions because they get to the root of things. And I love that. And I think that's so important, especially when trying to understand behavior, when negotiating, trying to understand somebody's interests in situations of conflict. Like why questions are golden, but they can come across as accusatory and judgmental. And so for me, what I do with why questions is I put them in a frame. And what I mean by that is I add a preamble or I qualify the question before I ask it. So I may say something like, just so I understand where you're coming from. And then I would ask my question. Or just to make sure we're on the same page, whatever it is. The point is that you're making your intentions explicit before you ask the question as a way to disarm the defensiveness that may come when somebody's beginning to wonder, why are they asking me that question? And so, of course, the tone matters. That. The tone matters as well, and how you ask why questions. And I think there's also a cultural aspect to this as well. Like I think that I'm originally from Israel. And if I pay attention to the patterns of questions that we ask in Hebrew, why question is very, 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 very common. And I think here in the US, where I'm situated right now, I learned to be more sensitive to that question. In hostage negotiation, where situation is very, very tense, FBI protocol is to try to avoid those why questions and to maybe pivot to a what question, and which is very similar, like what's important to you about this, as opposed to why is this important to you, or a how question. Still open-ended. But I have my issue with open-ended, but we'll come back to that, maybe.
Yes, we'll come back to that, the open-ended questions. And I wonder whether the why question, so thank you for elaborating that. I love it. And to have a preamble to prepare the ground, to facilitate the why question is a very good tip. And I wonder whether they might be avoided because they trigger too many emotions. So then it's difficult to regulate the emotions that the why elicits.
It may be, again, it's how you ask it, and it's the tone, and I think, as you said earlier, it's the relationship you have with that person. Like, if you ask why questions of yourself, you're not going to get offended.
Yes.
And why is that? Because there's kind of there's assumption of positive intent in the authenticity of the question itself.
And maybe it's okay. I'm thinking out loud. Maybe it's the same reason why we cannot tickle ourselves.
Yeah. Which is.
Right?
It's a mystery. Why can't we expect it? Why is it?
I don't know, but I think it's because we expect it. And the same thing as if we ask ourselves why questions, we cannot offend ourselves because it's somehow expected. We stay in the safe zone.
For those of you who are just listening to this conversation, Miriam and Roi are trying to tickle themselves as we speak. You can't tickle someone virtually either.
No, that's true. Well, maybe with a question.
Maybe. Tickle my brain. There should be like a tickle emoji or something here.
Yes. Ah, good one. What is it about open questions that you don't like?
It's been gospel. It's not like I'm against open questions. It's like being against puppies in our world if you're like against open-ended questions. I'm not against open-ended questions. There's a gospel in the world of learning and development and facilitation and so on that you should default into asking open-ended questions. And there's a logic to it. You want to broaden the space for response as opposed to constrict it and narrow it. Those closed-ended questions supposedly lend themselves to a binary yes or no response. I get it. My experience is that it's very rare that when you ask a closed-ended question that you're just going to get like yes, no. So, for example, if you were to ask, can you walk me through your thinking? It's a closed-ended question.
Sure.
How often people are going to be like, yes. And then just be quiet. So most closed-ended questions will tend to have an open-ended response. In addition to that, like sometimes it might be qualitatively different. And it is also true that sometimes you want short answers. You do want concise and short answers. You might do that deliberately. There's a function to closed-ended questions. In negotiation, for example, closed-ended questions, if you want to find out if somebody's lying, closed-ended questions are much better than open-ended questions. For example,
what would that be?
Well, let's say I have here my phone with me, and let's say I want to sell my phone to you, and you are wondering, you want to know about the history of the phone. So you can ask like somebody like, what is the history of the phone? And hopefully they will share with you all the information that you need to know. That's very different than asking someone, has this phone been damaged? Just close-ended question. It's much more difficult to omit the truth than it is by open-ended questions where they can roam anywhere and still answer you authentically. So,
because you can also avoid it. So in storytelling, you can hide the facts and then avoid the cognitive dissonance if nobody wants to be a lie.
Exactly.
Liar.
Right. So closed-ended questions have gotten a bad rap. They have a function, they have a utility, and they often give you a broader answer than most people think they do. And there's very little research that actually suggests that open-ended questions produce more than closed-ended questions. But we take it as gospel, that that's in fact the case. For me, the more important question versus open versus closed is, I would put two more categories into our conversation. And one is authentic versus inauthentic question. Closed or open, and the follow-up question. For me, actually, the single most important question that you need to master as a facilitator, as a teacher, is a follow-up question. Because the follow-up question, be it closed or open, demonstrates that you're present, demonstrates that you're listening, demonstrates that you care. That's the question.
Thank you. Yes. wasn't a question. My answer is yes. I love that for the reasons you mentioned. The follow-up questions show your presence. And the closed questions, I think it also depends whether it's a rhetoric question.
Yeah.
And because a closed question there can be different intentions behind a closed question. Do you mind elaborating? Is actually not really a question. It's please elaborate.
Right. It's a statement masquerading as a
exactly.
question. Yeah.
Have you ever thought of doing X? It's not a question. It's an advice.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we mask statements with a question mark and call it a question because we don't have the courage to make the statement.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I said authentic versus inauthentic.
Yes. So never ask a question if you know the answer or if you're not interested in the answer.
Exactly. It's got to come from a place of genuine curiosity.
Yeah.
And whether closed or open. And those examples that you gave are examples of leading questions. They're statements pretending to be questions. They're not questions in my book.
Yeah.
But let me add one more thing in favor of closed-ended questions, which is not where I'm going to get canceled for this. When it comes to kids, again, thinking about all my wisdom as a facilitator and as a teacher, I was like, let me ask you open-ended questions, and you get this blank cow-like stare in response. Like they do not know how to respond. But when you begin, and I'm talking about ages 2, 3, 4, 5, when you ask more targeted questions that are close-ended and you're giving them more of a binary choice, do you want to do X, do you want to do Y, then there's much more of a response. When you say, how was school today, open-ended, if you're lucky, you'll get good. But if you
very interesting
specific questions about people's experience, like what is something new that you learned today, open-ended, but more specific, more targeted in that way. What is something surprising that you learned today? What questions did you ask today? Then you're more likely to have a more interesting response.
And it reminds me of the boundaries that we need in order to be creative and for our brain to think, because we do need a context.
Yes.
If it's too broad, we are missing the context and then it's boring. The more context or the more boundaries we have around a topic or a question, the more interesting it gets, because then also the more nuanced it gets. And I once recorded a podcast episode with Thomas Lanthaler about the art of not asking questions. So his statement was, let's skip the questions at all and see how this goes. And we did a workshop actually around that. And what I took away that was fascinating is that questions keep us safe, especially when we're in the role of a facilitator, a coach, or even a parent. Asking a question keeps you on the safe side because you're putting the entire responsibility to come up with an answer on the shoulders of someone else. Whereas when you're making a statement, you're taking the risk.
Yes.
And you're making yourself vulnerable and allowing the other person to build on that. And this might then also be an argument for the closed questions. That you're basically helping the other person by restricting it and still leaving them the opportunity to say something else or to elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I like to mix it up. Like as my style as a facilitator, I'll deliberately ask closed-ended questions, open-ended questions, or not real questions. Like think about like an agenda break where somebody says, do you have any questions? Closed-ended questions. I'll try that. And I'll try, what questions do you have? And I'll try thoughts, questions, observations, pushback. Yeah. And which is not structurally, like grammatically a question, but it comes across as a question. And sometimes I'll try nothing and I'll try silence and just experiment with it and see what works. And it creates also a variety for people's ears and eyes as I do that as a facilitator as well.
Yeah, which then brings, again, the art of facilitation in where, depending on the group, their dynamics, the audience, you have to adjust your tools.
That's right.
So there's not one size fits all.
Yeah.
So the question that I was parking in the beginning was, what label are you now putting on your forehead that it's not facilitation?
Well, I don't know. One of my favorite book is by a friend of mine called, her name is Irshad Manji, but the book is called Don't Label Me. but I guess there are some very meaningful labels to me as a husband, as a father. Like that's the first things that come to mind. Professionally, I am a facilitator and I'm a teacher and I'm a professor, but a more salient identity for me these days is CEO and founder. So I don't go walking around like with that on my forehead, but that is part of my professional identity.
And how has facilitation helped you to become a better CEO and founder?
It's defaulting to that mode of inquiry. It's leading with a power with approach. My approach as a leader is not a power over. And by the way, I mentioned this distinction earlier. I got to give credit where credit is due. Are you familiar with that binary power over versus power with?
Yes. And maybe you still want to explain that.
I will, of course. It closed-ended question, right? Are you familiar with it? The binary itself, or the concept dichotomy, comes from the work of somebody that I hope your audience gets to know. I hope they know, and if they don't, I hope they get to know somebody named of Mary Parker Follett, Follet. And she is maybe double T, I don't know. But she is somebody who is a public intellectual who lived 100 years ago. And in her writing, she wrote about conflict, she wrote about power, she wrote about management. She's the mother of modern negotiation theory, conflict resolution theory, and management theory as well. And most people know her ideas, but people have stolen her ideas and people haven't given her the credit that she deserves. I'm on a mission to share her wisdom with folks. And one of her concepts was the idea of a power over versus power with. And I think as teachers, this is something that it's an approach that often we take. We take a power over, more directive approach. I have the wisdom, I have the knowledge, and I'm going to share it with you. I'm going to instruct, I'm going to tell you how to think and what to think or whatever it may be. And a power with is like we're co-creating something together. And so I of course I have my expertise. You have your knowledge, you have your wisdom, you have your experience, and we're going to create something together here that's going to be slightly unique or very unique than any other experience that we have with anyone else. And so I take that approach as a leader as well. And that means that I want to elicit voice. That means that I want to default to a mode of curiosity. I want to ask questions. I want to be attentive to the responses. I want to create a climate where people are willing to take interpersonal risks with one another without feeling like their status is on the line, their relationship or their job security is on the line. I want to create more psychological safety on my team. That I learned all of that as a facilitator. And I bring that into my leadership approach as well.
I love that. It also relates to the leading from the front of the room versus the back of the room, or standing in a circle.
Yeah. That's so front of the room, back of the room, or standing in a circle. Walk me through standing in a circle.
Somehow when I just said it, so front of the room for me is really the teaching, the old school teaching style. Back of the room is what used to be said about the kind leader or the facilitator. So you're making yourself invisible, but then power with, for me, elicits more the image of standing in a circle with the group. So it's, being together on equal side and having a conversation without the power dynamics, without the hierarchy.
Yeah. I think that there's still probably some power. I think there's always power dynamics in any room. And it doesn't mean that you have all the power. They might have all the power. All they got to do is just turn off their camera or go away or shut it down, or in a real classroom, turn their backs to you or start talking and ignore you. Then you find out who has the power very, very quickly. And there's, by the way, a difference in being like a professor and being like working in organizations and doing workshops and trainings and all of that. You have a very different power for sure. You don't really have an ability to reward or an ability to punish. That's not where your power comes from when you're facilitating. That's probably a very good thing. But there's still power dynamics in the room. And you have power. You have power that's born out of your expertise as well. You have power in the sense that you're structuring the conversation, and you're kind of at some point making decisions about where we're going on this journey together that the individuals may not make or may not know how to make. And you have tools that they may not have as well. And then you have your charisma, and that influences people as well. You have your tactics that you're using to influence people. So I wouldn't say there's no power and you remove hierarchy altogether. It's just different. It's a healthier way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to come back to the topic of courage, because I think courage in the context of power is also interesting. And what I'm thinking of, that the more formal power you have, the less courage you need.
The more formal power you have, the less courage you need. Possibly. Yes. I think about it. So if I can define how I think about courage, and we'll come back to power, because power is in my definition of courage. And you can, the standard definition of courage is doing something hard and maybe even doing something right in the face of your fears. And building on that, my definition of courage is, I think about it as an equation. It's a bit of an unusual equation. It's power, coming back to your point, power plus purpose divided by dragons. And I'll break that down, if I may. Power, in my understanding of power here, is simply capacity to impact your environment. Mm-hmm. You have an ability to act on your intentions, make your intentions happen. Purpose is making sure that power is wedded to a worthy cause. That's there's a moral dimension to courage as well. And then the denominator dragon is a stand-in for all the stuff that gets in the way. So it's your fear, and it's your anxiety, and it's your ego, and whatever else, your insecurities, whatever else makes it harder for you to do the thing that you're trying to do. And so in a workshop where maybe we talk about courage, strategically, what I'm trying to do is give people the knowledge and the tools to increase the numerator and decrease the denominator. But power is an essential component of it, because it's an ability to do something. It's not a nefarious force of some kind. And I don't mean it as formal authority, but I just mean capacity and ability.
Beautiful. And then basically, if you have lots of fear, lots of anxiety, you need even more power in order to have the courage.
Yes, that's exactly correct.
Yeah. How did you come up with this equation?
I don't know. I just did. Probably in the shower. I have a little notebook in the shower that I constantly use. I love coming up with ideas, both in on the toilet and in the shower. So my favorite places to come up with ideas. Yeah, and maybe I was watching like Game of Thrones. Like I like dragons, and I should say, when I'm talking about dragons here, I'm talking about dragons as conceived of like in the medieval West, like Game of Thrones or House of Dragon in Western mythology. I don't mean dragons as conceived of in China or in Japan in the East, which is a really like a noble symbol and
power,
sense of vitality of life. It's a very, very positive symbol. Very, very different understanding of that symbol. And I became really aware of that because my wife is from China, and when I shared with her my equation, she's like, Why does dragon mean this? And so I was like, there's definitely a bias here that I need to be aware of and articulate when I talk about my definition of courage.
And might totally turn it around. And maybe courage is also different in cultural contexts.
Yes.
Whether it's something positive or negative. I remember that a client of mine, actually, he looked at me at some point and said, Miriam, don't forget that courage is born out of fear.
Yeah, courage is born out of fear. I think one of the biggest misconceptions around courage is that it's fearlessness. The other day, somebody on my team wrote to me and described me in jest, like as a fearless leader. And I think in jest, I don't know. I took it in jest. But thinking about that, it's like, that's not a very courageous leader. And so, courage is not like, it's not the absence of fear. It's often just the recognition that there's some things more important than your own fear. Like that's what that is. And as a teacher, I think you need to have a lot of courage. And that's something that's more important than fear. It's coming back full circle to what we mentioned earlier, but linking outwards, like your action to something beyond yourself. Like that's the secret to courage.
Beautiful. Yes, the fearless leader almost sounds overconfident. So a fearless leader, if you don't have fear, then you might take risks that are not worth it, or that would endanger the purpose, the bigger cause.
Yeah.
And thinking of your definition of courage, it then And what you said about psychological safety then almost means that a courageous leader is taking in all that fear and overcoming it on behalf of the group. So there's one who needs to be courageous in order to create the psychological safety for the others so that they don't have to be courageous.
So yes, sort of. I partly agree with that. I think that no matter how good and how skillful you are in creating a climate of psychological safety, you'll still need courage. The people, the participants will still need courage. The people on your team will still need courage, even if they know that you are not going to judge them harshly and that they're going to be accepted for what it is that they have to say. There's some conversations that no matter level of psychological safety, the people are still going to feel some anxiety around.
So whenever it becomes vulnerable and personal, you mean?
Yeah.
Admitting
mistakes.
Thank you. Yes.
Admitting mistakes, sharing an idea that's a little bit different, giving somebody I care about tough feedback. I know that you're not going to judge me and you're not going to disrespect me and you're not going to fire me, but it's still hard for me to do so. And hard for a number of reasons. Some of them could just be my personal history, my biography, like whatever it is. There'll still be a need for courage. It just won't be the same level of need as an environment where psychological safety is wanting.
Yeah. Do we need the same tools to create an environment for people to be courageous as an environment to feel psychologically safe?
I think it's slightly different. I think you can split track it here, like in two different tracks. One is like, what skills do I need as a leader to create an environment where people are willing to take those interpersonal risks? And there I can think about like, how do I communicate the message of why that's important? I can think about listening and questioning skills. I can think about what is my philosophy around failure and how do I articulate that to my team? I can think about how I elicit feedback, how I share my own developmental areas. Like all of those things are really, really important for creating that environment, that culture, and constantly like checking in and testing for that. Very, very important, assessing it. There's another skill set, though, for having the courage to do some of this stuff, which is the intrapersonal skills that people need to develop, regardless of the environment.
So this is then where trust comes in?
Trust, I think, comes in more on as a function of both, maybe. But here I'm thinking about how do I regulate my own emotions in order to be courageous. So those intrapersonal skills.
Okay.
About how do I communicate my message effectively? How do I do so reducing in a way that reduces defensiveness and increases receptiveness on the part of my partner? Those are different focus area, different levels of skills to develop.
Good one. Thank you. What is your number one facilitation challenge?
My number one facilitation challenge currently, I think not to get in my own way, I would say. And what I mean by that is somebody maybe does something in a session that catches my attention in a negative way. And then I'll kind of split and I'll still do my job. But in my head, I'm beginning to like evaluate what I did or maybe evaluate what they're doing. And I'm multitasking like when it's happening. And I can't but imagine that decreases the quality of the facilitation. And I'm just as present in the moment. And so getting out of my own way, I think here, and that's a dragon, if you will, that I need to constantly slay.
Yeah, and it relates to what you said previously, this inward focus.
That's right.
Then suddenly, instead of the outward focus to be there for the group.
Yeah. How about yourself?
I think, being triggered is one. And even maybe before the workshop is to get the purpose right. Because what I realize most of the times is even the briefing is as good as they want, and I speak with all the participants, and then someone decides, okay, this is the workshop going to be about, and then you arrive, and where in fact, there's something clearly more important that needs to be addressed first, or the lack of, and that maybe goes hand in hand, is the rushing into things, not acknowledging that before we can speak content, we need to create connection and relations. So in order to have creative new ideas, or in order to challenge each other, for which we need to be courageous, we first need to create the space where we trust each other and where we feel psychological safety.
Yeah, that's another really interesting one. And I think sometimes that space, it's like bi-directional, right? So you're doing something to create it. And as you're doing it, like the trust follows. Like sometimes we need trust in order to do it. And sometimes we need to do it and trust is just follow. I think often we assume like we need to have first trust and then everything else. And then we can be vulnerable, for example. But sometimes it's the other way around.
Chicken and egg.
Yeah. And that's kind of an interesting challenge as a facilitator.
How do you create that?
That being what?
The atmosphere where either trust can be created or psychological safety can be created to kick it off.
I do a few things. One is I think about, before going in, I think about my audience. So I get in kind of the right mindset. I actually have a little chair here, you see, and for those who are just listening, it's a tiny little chair that I put next to my computer. If I'm doing a virtual session, I'll take with me if it's an in-person session. And it's there to remind me of my audience and remind me of what it's like to be them going into that particular session. And I may have some information about them that I got from a sponsor, and that might be useful. It might be not, I don't know, but it puts me in the right mindset. So that's like the first thing that I do. And it might be even just like a couple of minutes before the session, but that's kind of my switch. And then it's a matter of like making those early connections with people. And it could be just asking a particular question from, if it's a one-on-one at first, or some people are coming in, and it could be using some humor in the element. It may be showing some vulnerability on my end. Like there are many different ways that I think probably unconsciously like create connections with people. And then through the content itself, I think that people are able to sniff out like both quality and the authenticity of the content and the speaker very, very quickly. Some of what the research shows us is that one of the first things that people assess right away is when they see you, and especially when you begin the workshop, is your level of warmth, like how friendly you are towards them, and your level of competence. Like, do you know what you're talking about? Can you deliver your intentions? And we need to do both of those to, I think, engender trust. So it might be in my bio, in the way I talk about myself, demonstrating some competence. It might be in the way I articulate my messages. And then the warmth is these moments of connection. It's the use of humor. It's the type of questions that you ask. It's the way in which you respond to your audiences and what they say and what they don't say. All of that goes, it's the nonverbals. Even virtually, like, am I making eye contact with you right now? Am I looking at the camera? Am I opening up my own body language here? Or am I closing up? Am I opening this medial line between my belly button and my collarbone, even when you cannot see it, fully? It's a gesturing. It's moving in a little bit closer when somebody is speaking. It's those little things, these kind of micro behaviors that verbally and non-verbally that go a long way in establishing whether this person is trustworthy on the level of warmth and the level of competence.
And thank you for guiding us through a few pointers on how to read body language, even through the screen, right?
Even through the screen, yeah.
Because there is something, I guess, as you said, just leaning in and being closer to the camera, literally revealing more about ourselves, being more seen, opening up, maybe also even showing our hands in the camera. I think it does something to our brains that suddenly we feel, okay, don't have a gun, I'm safe.
Exactly. Yeah. And even like the camera angle, like, are you looking down at somebody? Are you looking up? Are you looking straight ahead? I think these little things matter subconsciously or are impactful subconsciously.
Yes. Hello, listener. Are you tired of listening to my podcast voice praising our sponsor Session Lab in each episode? I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. So if you are as much of a Session Lab fan and user as I am, please share your experience and praise, and don't be shy of add a sentence of self-promo. Send me your soundbite and you might hear yourself on the next show and find your name and URL in the show notes. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.